I think we're ready. I think we can go ahead and start. I want to welcome all of you for being here today with us. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for connecting. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Rosa Celorio, and I serve as Associate Dean of International and Comparative Legal Studies here at GW Law School. Thank you so much for coming to this event, and it is wonderful to see so many people interested in the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women that we will be discussing today. And I have to say, I am so honored and excited to be able to introduce our main speaker today. She's the current United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dr. Reem Al-Salem. Thank you so much for being here with us today and taking time from your very busy schedule to share your wisdom and thoughts and remarks with us today. And Dr. Al-Salem has a very long list of accomplishments before her appointment, so I just want to highlight some. She was appointed as UN Special Rapporteur on July of 2021 and began her tenure on August of 2021. She has a very lengthy experience as an independent consultant and also an international civil servant for many United Nations agencies, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, but also many United Nations departments, including UN Women, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNICEF, and the International Organization for Migration. She also has a master's degree in international relations from the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and also a master's in human rights law from the University of Oxford. I'm also incredibly excited to introduce our own professor, Dr. Leila Hanafi, who also made this event possible today. So thank you so much, Leila, for making this kind of discussion a reality and for allowing us as a program, the International and Comparative Law Program, to contribute to these discussions in this way today. Dr. Hanafi currently works as a senior legal advisor for the World Bank, in which she has worked on programs related to forced displacement and other issues. And she also has a very lengthy experience serving in legal advisory roles in international non-governmental organizations, foreign governments, United Nations agencies, and has held a number of leadership positions as well at the American Bar Association's World Justice Project and the International Criminal Courts Coalition work across the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Hanafi holds a doctorate degree from the University of Kent Law School and an LLM degree from George Washington University Law School. So she's also one of our alums, which is something that we always like to see. And she also currently teaches a number of courses at the law school as an adjunct professor. She teaches in our legal research and writing program. She also teaches the course on English legal drafting structure, and she will soon be teaching also in our international human rights law curriculum. I want to welcome you both again today to this event, and thank you so much for agreeing to share remarks with us. And I just wanted to say shortly that I actually feel very, very privileged and honored to be with both of you and all of the participants today. And one of the people that have been very lucky, I've been able to work a lot with women's rights issues and gender-based violence throughout my career. I still teach in the area and also publish scholarship in the area. And I've been able to work very closely with the mandate of the United Nations Rapporteur over the years. And I just wanted to share 4 things that have always impressed me about the mandate. I mean, one of them is that I think the mandate has been so important in filling out a void in the United Nations. The reality is that we don't have a treaty in the United Nations that prohibits gender-based violence, even though, of course, CEDAW has been interpreted as including gender-based violence in General Recommendations 19 and 35. We don't have a global treaty, even though we have one at the regional level. And I think the UN Special Rapporteur has been a critical player in filling up that void, in actually providing content on international obligations that states have, in the absence of that treaty. I think also the mandate has greatly contributed to what we understand today as gender-based violence and how we define its different forms, contexts, and also in the present times. I think also the UN Rapporteurship has been so strategic in forging all these very important relationships at the United Nations level with the CEDAW committee and also all these other UN mechanisms and also at the regional mechanisms level. When I worked at the Human Rights Commission of the OAS, we used to collaborate with the UN Rapporteurship all the time, and the process was led by the UN Rapporteur. I hope this continues as well. And lastly, one thing that I've always found absolutely fascinating about this mandate is the ability to adapt to modern times, to present times. It's a mandate that always has to be able to respond to what's happening in the present. Like, for example, now we're talking about violence in the digital space. We're talking about violence and climate change. We're still in a world where we have major armed conflicts, as we saw this morning. We have femicide, we have forms of backlash, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's a mandate that has been very capable at adapting, to what happens in the present times. Without further ado, I want to give the floor to Dr. Al-Salem, and after Dr. Al-Salem gives her remarks, we will have some commentary from Dr. Hanafi. We will have some time for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat as well. And Dr. Al-Salem, thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Dean Celerio and Dr. Hanafi, for this kind of invitation. And perhaps just to, at the onset, have a small correction. I don't actually have a PhD, so it's a title that that I don't deserve, Dr. Al-Salem. So, in any case, I'm very pleased to be here and to speak to you today. And I thought I could speak a little bit about the mandate and the areas of work that I'm focusing on. Though, of course, I have to admit that, especially in a day like today, it feels a bit surreal to talk about that. Of course, like others, my thoughts go to the people of the Ukraine, and especially the civilians of the Ukraine who are going to bear the brunt of this conflict. And of course, as is the case in all conflicts, women and children are the most affected by it. As Dean Celerio mentioned, I took on my functions as UN Special Rapporteur around 8 months ago. And for those who don't know about the position of the Special Rapporteur, this was established in '94 by the then UN Commission on Human Rights through a resolution that has been renewed since then. And of course, when the Human Rights Council was established, superseding and replacing the Commission, the mandate started reporting to the Human Rights Council. Now, sometimes there is a misunderstanding about this position in the sense that many people think that I'm a UN bureaucrat. I'm not. I'm an independent expert. My accountability lies primarily with the Human Rights Council. So in that sense, I don't report, for example, to Secretary General Guterres. I don't report to the Secretariat. And this is, as Dean Celerio mentioned, actually one of the perhaps strengths of the special procedures and a mandate holder like my position is that we are totally independent. We are basically hired or brought because of our expertise, and we're not even paid for the work that we do in order to maintain really completely this independence. This said, as Dean Celerio mentioned, it's very ambitious, actually, what the mandate has been doing and trying to do. So according to the official sort of terms of reference, I'm supposed to request and seek and receive information on violence against women, basically from all stakeholders, whether it's governments, treaty bodies, specialized agencies. I'm supposed to recommend measures and ways at all levels, whether it's local, national, regional, or international, to eliminate all forms of violence against women and also its causes, and to remedy its consequences. And as you rightly mentioned also, Dean, there is a very important element of working together with other relevant stakeholders, treaty bodies, obviously other special procedures. You mentioned the Commission on the Status of Women. There, of course, the Commission is very important, and the mandate does participate in the Commission's opening debate. The mandate usually gives a presentation, but I do think that, for example, that is an organism that the mandate could work much more closely with. And in fact, this year, as the Commission on the Status of Women is going to be reviewing its method of work, I have actually sent also some recommendations on how my mandate and the Commission could work closer together so that we really can provide a unified message and guidance, and also complement each other in a much more meaningful way. Just a little bit about my own background when it comes to this topic. Of course, my involvement or my experience with violence against women precedes assuming this function. I'm a woman myself, as you may have noticed, and so it should come as no surprise to say that, like most women in their lifetime, I've also experienced gender-based violence, and in particular sexual harassment. And in a sense, I do consider myself lucky not to have experienced more severe forms of sexual gender-based violence, like sexual violence or other types of gender-based violence. And it's really sad that as women, we consider ourselves lucky when this doesn't happen, because of course, most women in the world are not so lucky. It is globally estimated that 736 million women, that's 1 in 3, have been subjected to physical and or sexual intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both, at least once in their lifetime. And 30% of these are women aged 15 and older. Now, these figures, I should clarify, do not include sexual harassment. So if we were to add sexual harassment, obviously they would be a lot higher. The other way I got involved in this issue is, of course, through my long work as a humanitarian, specifically working with the UN Refugee Agency with refugees and migrants and stateless persons, I should add. And there, of course, being a refugee or a migrant or in a situation of statelessness, it means that you're also particularly exposed to gender-based violence, either in the countries in which you resided, your habitual country of residence, or along the migration route, or even in the country in which you end up. And and in that context, I worked with others to put in place systems to try to protect women against violence, to help victims and survivors, and at times also to try to help them restart their lives in a way that is free from violence and with dignity. So that said, I should say that these experiences, and with time, having of course worked in many different countries, I've also come to realize that violence against women is actually, unlike what we might think, not restricted to any one specific country or place. It's also not proportionate to the level of economic development of a country, because everywhere women and girls still being killed, still at serious risk of violence or experiencing violence, including intimidation, harassment, including online, as Dean mentioned. And and it's really, there's really one way to describe it, that what we are witnessing and living in is really a pandemic of violence against women. A pandemic that has existed really long before this current COVID pandemic has come on the scene, and that, as many of you probably know, has compounded the effect of the pandemic of violence against women. And there, my predecessor has actually also looked at that very closely. She produced a report on the impact of COVID-19, for example, on domestic violence. And her conclusion was that there are clear indications that COVID-19 has generally increased incidence of domestic violence against women. And she has also expressed concern that in general, especially at the time when she wrote that report, which I believe was in 2020, the policies that governments were taking were largely gender blind when it came to addressing and dealing with the consequences of COVID. Now, of course, one of the worst forms of gender-based violence is femicide, or gender-related killings, which again continues to rage everywhere. It's mainly committed by men. It's mainly actually committed by men that victims know. And it involves intimate partners, but not only. So that's something to take into account. And as you can imagine, having comparable data, having data also that shows the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator is still a challenge for the majority of the countries across the board. And that's why the mandate has also prioritized over the years the issue of femicide and has demanded of countries to establish a femicide or gender-related killing watch in order to also improve the understanding of this and also to gather better data with the ultimate objective, of course, of reducing and ending it. And so what this initiative is that my mandate was involved in is that every 25th of November, which is of course the International Day on Elimination of Violence Against Women, the mandate puts out a call to stakeholders, so states, NGOs, UN agencies, asking for information, for data on femicide, and publishes a report the subsequent year on basically the input it has received. I have not yet published the analysis of the data that we've received, but it should be forthcoming. There will be a report coming, an article coming out in a how do you call it, a magazine or a review that will analyze some of the trends, and then we will also put out a lengthier independent piece as well. So, you know, in a nutshell, what we can say is that in the last few years, it's true that many challenges remain, obviously, especially, as I said, when it comes to the data. But it's true that there's also been progress in the sense that a number of countries have actually created different types of bodies with the purpose of monitoring violence against women and femicide. So, for example, Argentina has really made a lot of efforts on that, Spain, Morocco, among others. And in a number of these countries like Canada and Honduras, also, non-state actors are involved in monitoring femicide, like universities, for example, are at the forefront of creating femicide watch bodies, and also civil society, especially where governments don't have their own watches. So in a way, these actors have filled an important gap in that regard. And despite still the many gaps, of course, when it comes to data, progress has been made on collection and systematization of data on femicide, although the issue is, of course, that countries also have different methodologies and scope. And there are countries where they don't even yet recognize femicide in their criminal law as a crime. And so that's quite still widespread also. Now, the other thing that Dean alluded to is, of course, that the mandate continues to look at and deal with the issue of conflict-related rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. So, for example, one of the first communications I put out when I became rapporteur was, of course, relating to the conflict in Ethiopia, where rape and sexual violence was used really on a very large scale, and what appears to have been systematic by warring parties in the three regions that were engulfed in the war. So that continues to be, unfortunately, still a main part of the work that I do as a rapporteur. As you know, rape and sexual violence can act as constituent elements of war crimes, crimes against humanity, as we were discussing just shortly, genocide, torture, and other violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And here, what I would also like to highlight that my mandate and other international human rights and regional human rights mechanism, we have a platform that brings all of us together. It's called the EDWAO platform. I will spare you what it stands for because it's a very long name. But basically, one of the things that we collectively emphasized is that sexual violence and violence against women during conflict is not something that can be understood in isolation from gender-based discrimination that women experience in times of peace. Actually, it's on the contrary, in the sense that this violence is connected to and derives from more general patterns of gender inequality and violence against women. And when these general patterns are already there, even preceding conflict, this results in women becoming more vulnerable to conflict-related violence and human rights violations. And this results also in an increased failure to provide them with access to interim measures and reparations. And so what we said is that if we want to deal with gender-based violence during conflict, we have to address the root causes of that in a holistic way, which means also dealing with it along the continuum of before, during, and after a conflict. And again, in order to find any solution on issues that are important to women, of course, it's very important to ensure the full and meaningful participation of women, including in political negotiations during a conflict, after a conflict, in peace processes, in governance processes. And this was all at the heart, obviously, of the Security Council Resolution 1325, which you all know, and which, among other things, also tried to address sexual violence in conflict. And of course, as we all know, there are many challenges still in the implementation of Resolution 1325. Though, of course, in the chambers of the UN, you will hear many representatives reasserting their belief in it, their importance, but on the ground, a lot still remains to be done. And related, therefore, to it, and one of the things that explains why it is challenging also to implement it, is that in the last few years, of course, we have come to understand better another phenomena. I don't know how new we can say it is, or maybe what is new is our understanding of it, which is violence against women in politics. And this is a form of violence that is highly misogynistic, that targets women in an attempt to silence them as political actors. And it is a specific form of GBV that, of course, encompasses a range of attacks that are aimed to undermine them and exclude women as a group from political life and to silence them as political actors. And since intersectionality is very important in how you look at this, of course, then specific types of or profiles of women, like younger women, like LGTB women, they are at heightened risk of abuse and of violence when they are involved in politics. And this form of violence, among the other obviously direct negative consequences, also has the result of inhibiting other women from entering and remaining in politics. And more worryingly, it also threatens democracy and its underlying principles. And also, as Udine mentioned, though the old classical forms of violence haven't gone away, today we also see other sort of new forms of violence, or let's say forms of violence tend to have now further platforms and avenues to mushroom, to adapt, and they occupy new spaces. And as you rightly mentioned, that's why we also see now a lot of online violence. And the problem there, of course, is that in many countries, we still don't have the robust laws in place to regulate the use of online technologies and to ensure that they conform to human rights standards. So this form of violence has been able to hide behind the seemingly borderless nature of the internet. But we have to really collectively really take action on this, because of course we can't have one place, the physical world, where a set of human rights standards apply, and pretend that online or in the virtual space, it's the Wild West where they don't apply or something else applies. And so there is a need really to bring more like governance to really govern the space, and also to hold these companies, these online technologies also accountable, and make sure that they also take action and have regulations in place to prevent these acts of violence. Now, of course, I'm not saying that laws alone will solve the problem. Of course, we understand that you need comprehensive interventions. So, you need obviously education about what it means to have online safety, what online forms of violence mean. But also, you do need to end the impunity, of course, of digital acts of gender-based violence. And you need to train and equip law enforcement with the necessary instruments and knowledge to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. And since we're on the issue of newish understandings of forms of violence, one of the things that my mandate has been actively seized with, and that I personally even didn't know that much about before I took on this role, is what I've seen as a worrisome practice or application in some judicial systems, which is that in some countries, this ingrained gender stereotypes, including in the justice system, has led them to favor the testimonies of fathers at the expense of mothers in custody battles, even when mothers bring forward well-founded allegations against the father that he has been abusive of their children. So even when, for example, social services or a medical doctor brings in evidence showing that the child has been sexually molested or abused, when the child has even come forward, there is this inclination to feel by the justice system that the mother is manipulating the child, that she's trying to alienate the child from the father. And then you get very bizarre decisions that either still continue to grant joint custody or even to punish the mother, grant full custody to the father and then also imprison the mother. We've seen this in Spain, and I've also received cases from Brazil. I understand it's also in the US, in Israel, in a number of countries around the world. So this is something also that I hope to be able to address in one of my upcoming reports to the Human Rights Council. Now, all this, what we've just said, and here I want to come to also what you mentioned, Dean, in the very beginning, is happening, of course, against the backdrop of significant pushback against gender equality. There's a very well-organized anti-gender movement and coalition. It's very well organized, it's very well resourced, it plans, it knows what it wants, it's very assertive and takes initiatives. And so it's very worrisome because, of course, the agenda is to push back against gender equality, to push back against rights that have been won by women, hard-won rights. So to push back against sexual and reproductive health, to restrict the right to abortion, to scrap, for example, gender studies in university, or to cancel sexuality education at schools, not to mention, of course, all the other kinds of discrimination, violence they promote against persons of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations, and where women that also live outside this heteronormative framework are punished and are subjected to also conversion therapies and other serious violations of human rights. And here I want to come maybe to one point you raised about the fact that CEDAW does not. Well, we know that CEDAW doesn't, as you rightly mentioned, explicitly mention violence against women. However, CEDAW continues to be really the anchor, one of the cornerstones of gender equality, promoting gender equality and protection for women, including against violence. Also, thanks to the jurisprudence that was developed by the CEDAW committee in its recommendation 19 and 35. And which has allowed us to even deal with and address including these new forms of violence that I've talked about, even though, for example, online violence didn't exist perhaps in the way we see it today when CEDAW, when the convention was conceived, but it's still very much that framework, together with other, obviously, fundamental human rights treaties. It's still one of the most ratified also instruments in international human rights law, albeit with a number of reservations, of course, by a number of countries, but still we until now, we don't have, let's say, anything better. What concerns me is if we want to produce a separate treaty on violence against women right now in this current context, I would be afraid that this would actually open a Pandora's box, leading to the watering down of these standards because of the context in which it's happening. So I would suggest that rather than going down that route, one could look at an optional protocol to CEDAW, and there hopefully also adopting and taking in a lot of the very good, I think, articles and provisions that are in regional instruments that, like, for example, the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. There's also, others which have, for example, recognized economic violence as a form of violence against women, which is not in CEDAW. So there's been also progressive development since CEDAW that can be incorporated in an optional protocol. But to have a standalone right now, I would be frankly scared about that. So just to say that, of course, in addition to as we can imagine, the physical and psychological consequences of violence that survivors and victims have experienced, there is, of course, the wider impact on society, in that not only women cannot participate in things that are important to them, and in today's world, we're also much more confronted with existential issues like the climate crisis, for example, and environmental degradation. And this is one of the things, obviously, that I would also like to look at, and I will be presenting my upcoming report to the 77th session of the UN General Assembly on this issue. And I want to see also how deep pre-existing inequalities and policies to eliminate gender-based violence actually interact with the climate crisis, and also what it means now when there's now going to be an increasing diversion, let's say, of funds, social protection funds or social policy funds towards a response to the climate crisis. Will it be siphoned away from also, programs to address violence against women? Will we factor in, will we plan measures to address the issue of violence against women in disaster response, in disaster reduction strategies in a timely way? Have we learned any lessons basically also from the COVID response? So these are things that I'd like to look at in the report. And just perhaps to close is to say that then there's obviously it's very obvious. So one is surprised that violence against women is not taken more seriously. But of course, the whole prosperity of society is undermined. There are studies, even by the World Bank, about what it means for the GDP of a country with violence against women. What is the loss basically? But it goes beyond that, and it goes also really to the ability of a country, a nation, or even a region to prosper, and that's why I think it's not a coincidence in a way that the Sustainable Development Goals do speak to that issue, because ending violence against women is very much linked also to development. So in that sense, it's not a surprise. So I'll leave it here. Apologies if I took a bit too long, but I'm happy to also hear your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Reem, for sharing with us such a thorough overview of all of the challenges actually that your mandate has, but also the amazing opportunities that you have. We very much look forward to all the work that you're going to do. And now I'm going to cede the floor to Dr. Hanafi, who's going to give us some commentary before we move on to questions and answers from the audience. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll move on to them after Dr. Hanafi.
Thank you, Dean Celorio, and thank you so much, Reem, for reflecting on the challenges of violence against women, and specifically some of your enriching points on impact of COVID and climate change and issues like femicide, online violence, violence against women in politics, and others. Really, I want to be very brief and just amplify maybe some points and present some of my personal reflections before we turn it to everyone else for questions. And I just wanted to start by actually flagging that, as you all know, March is International Women's Month and International Women's Day. The theme this year is Changing Climates, Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. So we think it's a theme that recognizes the contribution also of women and girls working at this intersection of climate and gender equality. And this will also give visibility to the violence that exists in the context of displacement because of environment and climate change. And then really to start with my first point, I think an underpinning that is really relevant to the discussion today is linked to the adequacy of the international legal framework overall on violence against women, recognizing that the current legal framework has not been sufficiently implemented. So, for example, even states that have incorporated national laws aimed at addressing violence against women, we still see implementation gaps that are still remaining. And there is really a continuous need to emphasize the role of CEDAW, like the Special Rapporteur noted, as a dynamic and living instrument that really encompasses for now violence against women as a form of discrimination against women, and the progressive interpretation of the convention is really important. Also, I think it's interesting to note that there is a lack of a holistic or comprehensive approach to combating, preventing, and punishing violence against women. So here, really strengthening the synergies among CEDAW, the optional protocol, the Beijing, for example, platform for action, looking at resolutions like the Security Resolution 1325, SDGs, regional instruments, all of I think all of these instruments and platforms really offer an important opportunity for us to look into harmonization and how to achieve really implementation or progress towards implementation and accelerate the elimination of violence against women. So just this point on the lack of a holistic and comprehensive approach that is still there. And then a point for reflection that Reem also raised on whether there is a need for a specific global treaty or standalone treaty on violence against women. And here Reem expressed her reluctance on it, or maybe a protocol to CEDAW. I feel like there's still a divide and a debate. Some argue that a new treaty can have important symbolic value in galvanizing implementation at the state level. So really that symbolic value and potential to act as a catalyst for change could be compelling in a region like the Middle East that does not necessarily have a specific regional treaty on violence against women. And I really think that Reem's mandate has an important role to play in promoting collaboration between existing international, regional, and even national instruments on violence against women. And it would be helpful maybe if we have time to hear from you on how you perceive your role on that front. And then another briefly point that I wanted to reflect on, and that is the availability of data, which continues to be problematic. So for countries and communities to build back better after the pandemic, it is imperative to invest in preventing, responding to such violence, and really for us to ensure that women and girls are at the center of evidence-based and cross-sectoral policy making, or as we call it at the World Bank and within international organizations. But then the issue is relying really on data and carefully curated data is still an issue, either because it's not there or sometimes it's not interpreted the right way. And here I just wanted to flag that at the World Bank, we have the latest World Development Report is actually on data for better lives. And it argues that having accessible, available, and reliable data on violence against women and girls is crucial to informing policies in areas such as health, social protection, education, so we could really create effective solutions to address violence against women. And it's also striking to note here that the volume of data on violence against women and girls has increased over the last decade. And data on sexual violence, for example, and intimate partner violence is available. So at the World Bank, for example, we have something called the Gender Data Portal that has over, I think, 90 disaggregated indicators on violence against women. However, the issue is data is usually or often underutilized and can mask experiences of the most vulnerable women, including one area that I work on, which is the forcibly displaced women. So, for example, a recent series of studies from the World Bank, we've analyzed data from multiple countries to show, or that have shown, that women in conflict areas and those who have been forcibly displaced experience higher rates of intimate partner violence. And data coming from these studies confirm that intimate partner violence is more prevalent than sexual violence committed by armed actors, for example. So really, these studies demonstrate how data can correct and shape accurate narratives on violence against women that can really inform policy and programmatic investments. And this uptick really makes increasing investments in prevention and response to violence against women and girls even more urgent. And really think that we need to invest better, leverage accessible data on violence against women, because that will also help us in terms of defining a response framework that is really responsive, but also to monitor the impact on any actions that address violence against women and girls. One last point that I really quickly wanted to touch on is, again, just on this linkage on between the high levels of violence and basically displaced women. So here really to flag that the displaced women face worse on multiple fronts, including employment access, financial inclusion, for example, IPV, so intimate partner violence. And some of the research we've been doing at the World Bank, for example, through analyzing gender dimensions of forced displacement work, has drawn on survey data using innovative approaches to deepen the understanding of how forced displacement and violence against women intersect. And conflict and displacement affect every aspect of a woman's life. And as this research that we're doing highlights, it increases really the risk of abuse. So here clearly, I think what we need to flag is that high levels of violence clearly prevent the realization of, for example, the SDGs of eliminating violence against women, while also they're posing a serious threat to individuals and communities' ability to face and recover from any crisis. And really there's an urgency of revamping financing, prioritizing programming to prevent, respond, and mitigate risks of violence against women, especially through conflict and the displacement cycle. So I just wanted to really end by emphasizing really the importance of prevention, protection, and prosecution and redress with a victim and really like a survivor-centered approach to avoid a re-victimization basically episode again. And with that, I think I will stop because I see we only have 10 minutes left, but just to echo again, Dean Silorius, thanks to you, Reem, as the special rapporteur, and very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila. And you really highlighted some cornerstone points, when it comes to addressing gender-based violence today, the need for that holistic approach, the fact that we have this distance, between the law and the practice, the need for investment, the need for better data collection, and also that survivor-centric approach, that we want to have when it comes to gender-based violence. I actually have a number of questions in the chat, so I want to make sure that we can ask them, and I'm actually going to ask them together. And if you could answer them, in a group, this would be fantastic so that we have enough time. One of them is that there is an interest, if you could expand more on the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on online violence in particular, and where do you see this issue going? Second one is the cultural dimensions of violence against women. How do you think these can be addressed when it comes to your mandate? Also, your work with other United Nations rapporteurs, if you could discuss a little bit what the practices are, and the kind of collaborations that there are within the United Nations. Another question, and I found this particularly thought-provoking because many of us saw your statement, and I personally was so impressed. You released a statement on Afghanistan and Sharia law and its connection to women's rights. I've read that statement at least 5 times, and I couldn't believe it. The quality of it, the nuance of it, the perspective. I thought it was something innovative and cutting edge. The person that's asking the question is Aisa Gusel Öztürk, who just finished actually a fellowship at the International Court of Justice. She's from Turkey. We have discussed the statement repeatedly, and now that we have you here, we have to ask you what motivated that statement, that we all have so much respect for. And the last question, it's on, as you've seen, and you mentioned, there's been a trend in decriminalizing abortion, especially in Latin America. We certainly have 3 major countries, the last one being Colombia, that decriminalize abortion. And I think most of us are trying to grasp what this means, for gender-based violence and addressing issues of gender-based violence, especially sitting in a country where we're seeing actually the opposite, where we may lose, that flexibility. So if you could delve on that, that would be fantastic. And thank you both so much for being here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Dr. Leila, for these very pertinent points. I'll maybe address one point you made when it comes to a new treaty and the fact that it could be very useful for a region like the MENA region. In fact, as you know, many of the countries in that region, but not only, have actually introduced quite a lot of reservations to different articles of CEDAW, arguing, religious and cultural particularities, and that have tried to basically tamper with the equality and non-discrimination point of CEDAW. So my concern again would be, with a standalone treaty, how would it be different if even CEDAW didn't get away with that? But in any case, I take your point, and I agree that there needs to be more discussion on there, and there's a lot of division of opinion or diversity of opinion on that, and we should definitely discuss that more. Now, just very briefly, in the interest of time, there's a lot that can be said about online violence. And in fact, my predecessor, Mrs. Simonic, has produced a full report on that in 2018 on online violence from a human rights perspective. And there she presented a lot of the issues, but also quite a number of recommendations, whether it has to do with criminalization, whether it has to do with access to reparations, access to services, helplines. She discusses also the role of culture in there. And in fact, in the next week or two, some of us in the special procedure are providing also feedback to the Secretary General's Common Agenda, in which, as some of you may have seen, he is prioritizing the issue of governance of the online space, and there we have said that we think it could be more actually explicit and more daring when it comes to specifically addressing also violence against women, and to really pay more attention to that. And there have been obviously some thinking, and there's been countries where laws are being improved, for example, on the sharing of images in a non-consensual way, also threatening victims, and so on. So at Grevio, the body that monitors the Istanbul Convention, has also recently put out recommendations when it comes to online violence. Now, on Afghanistan, so there's a few things that motivated that op-ed. First of all, I was very concerned, obviously, that a de facto authority in this case, or a group that is in control of a territory and a people, was hiding behind its own, let's say, religious norms in order to justify grave violations of human rights of women and children, but also presenting this as, let's say, the one sort of narrative, religious narrative, because as we know, neither culture nor religion is a uniform whole, right? There are multiple voices, multiple interpretations, multiple approaches, and it's important to recognize that any religion or culture has trends in it that are enabling and supportive of human rights, including those of women and girls, and others that are not. And it's important to recognize that, because it's also important to work with faith and faith-based organizations in order to advance the protection of women. And here I want to actually say that there are many faith leaders, there are many faith-based organizations that actually do that. They might not always receive the attention or the publicity they deserve, but if we say that ending violence against women is something that is an all society approach, then we have to work with them. That's one. And so I wanted to address that, but I also wanted to, and in fact, I went beyond the op-ed, because we eventually sent also a letter to the de facto authorities, and it's public, you can all see it. But I basically wanted to show that Afghanistan has obligations under international human rights law, and there are many aspects in Islamic Sharia and fiqh that converge with Afghanistan's international human rights obligation. So it's also a way to say, actually, your own faith is mandating you to respect these international obligations. And it was also a way to try to find a common point where we can perhaps start speaking a language we both understand. So in order to see if there could be at some point some kind of dialogue, because obviously in these letters that we send to any government, we present them with allegations, and we present them also with the standards that these allegations concern. And given that they are so fixated on their own framework, I thought it would be important to at least bring that framework they consider as sacred or very important into the conversation. By the way, this emphasis on the fact that faith and faith-based organizations can also be a force of protection is not something I've invented. It's not something new. There are many organizations, including UN organizations, that have tried to do that. When I was with the UNHCR, I remember one of the first groundbreaking documents that came out, a research, I think it was commissioned by the Azhar, I'm not sure yet, but it tried to actually look at sort of the areas of convergence between refugee law and Islamic traditions. So it argued that in Islamic traditions, there is a very big emphasis also in the Quran on receiving people fleeing from violence or that are at risk, keeping them protected, including women, children, not attacking trees, and so on. And the ICRC also has emphasized that in their work. Obviously, they work in many countries that are Muslim majority countries, so they've tried to also emphasize the areas of convergence between humanitarian law and principles of the religion. So that's that. Now, when it comes to my work with other mandate holders, I work very closely with other mandate holders. In fact, we try as much as possible to communicate together on situations. I think for a mandate like mine, that is very important, given that intersectionality is so important. And when I first came to this position, one of the first things I did is I asked one of my staff to actually extract the references to GBV and gender equality in the reports of other mandate holders. And I found there was a lot of reference actually, and many of my colleagues have taken it upon themselves to dedicate reports and thematic focuses to women, to gender-based violence. And I think that's how it should be, right? Because it really interacts with other forms of discrimination, identities, and so on. And of course, there are rapporteurs that I work more closely with than others, simply because of the kind of issues that come to us. And what else? Let me see here. Yes, and then on abortion, yeah, it's interesting to see that, right? Like Texas, the Supreme Court in the US took one sort of went one way, and then you have countries like Mexico, like Colombia, take another. So it's I think that's demonstrative of exactly this polarization around gender issues and women's rights and women's bodies, and the attempt to control women's bodies it exemplifies that. And that's really the space, the rule of law, where a lot of these battles happen, and where it's also a source of concern, because even in countries that have very well established rule of law and just and high standards and legal systems, we have seen that we cannot take that for granted. And we have seen that these are among the first, let's say, places that the anti-gender equality movement tries to influence and tries to really get to. So this is I hope I answered those questions. So back to you, Dean Silero.
Thank you so much, Reem. Leila, do you have anything to add before we close this event?
No, I was just looking at the chat and replying directly and listening to Reem. So thank you so much.
I think we could be here for hours. Thank you so much, Reem and Leila, for your thought-provoking remarks, for making us think, for making us reflect on very important issues. You have our support. You know, we really look forward, Reem, to seeing what you're going to do with your mandate. And thank you, Leila, for everything you do for the law school and for your work at the World Bank as well. It's been an honor to host both of you today. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much. And my message is for wellness and health and everything good this year. I hope to see you.
Thank you very much for having me and for the very thought-provoking questions. I really enjoyed that.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.